Hi everyone, and welcome to my YouTube channel, dedicated solely to the collecting of cigarette packs, boxes, and labels. I aim to take you on a journey through time from the 1870s all the way through to the 1950s, and to share some of the stories of these beautiful and lovely items. I do hope you join me through my journey, and do click on the subscribe button as well. Thank you so much for watching. Lucky Strike, one of the most iconic and recognizable cigarette brands of all time. First introduced to the American public by the American Tobacco Company in late 1916, followed by a full national launch in January 1917. There would be many subtle variations of this brand during its lifetime, and it would even change its face during the Second World War. But how was such a brand conceived, and why? And what made it so successful in the first decades following its launch? In fact, the story of Lucky Strike started well before the First World War, and so we travel further back in time to learn of its origins. The brand was introduced in the early 1870s as sliced plug tobacco. Plug tobacco is made by taking the flakes or leaves of tobacco and condensing them to form a small brick-like shape that could be cut for smoking or chewing. Here is an example from my collection of what plug tobacco looks like. This sample dates to around the end of the 19th century and was made by a company called R.J. Reynolds. Ironically, Reynolds and his brand of Camel cigarettes was later going to be one of the main driving forces behind Lucky Strike cigarettes. But more on that later. The man who was responsible for bringing Lucky Strike onto the American market was a tobacconist from Virginia called Dr. Richard A. Patterson, who started his business in a 1.5-story factory building in 1856 with a working capital of only $800, making simple lump and twist tobacco. Business grew until the American Civil War erupted in 1861, stopping his enterprise completely, and so he enlisted and became a surgeon in the Confederate Army. After the war ended, he restarted his tobacco business in 1869 with the addition of 2 business partners, and the firm became called R.A. Patterson & Company. Here, you can see a representation drawn circa 1875 of the extension building that Patterson added to his original factory. And just 14 years later, in 1889, the company was incorporated with Patterson as president. The following is an advertisement from Patterson's company in June 1885, promoting a number of their early brands, including Lucky Strike. I wonder what happened to Big Buck and Mountain Rose. No one really knows definitively why Patterson chose to name his brand of plug tobacco Lucky Strike. It is said that the name was inspired by the gold miners as they headed out west to California during the gold rush of the mid to late 19th century in their hopes of striking it lucky. Regardless, the name stuck, and Patterson's Lucky Strike was later to make it into the history books. By the beginning of the 20th century, Patterson had relinquished control of his company to his son Malvin, and, like so many other independent tobacco companies of his day, Patterson Jr. came under the onslaught of Duke's mighty American Tobacco Company, also called the Trust, with all its resources coming to bear, focused on wiping out all and any competition in its quest to control the entire tobacco market. And, like so many of his contemporaries, Patterson was determined to hold out at all costs. Even as late as 1904, just a few years before ATC was famously dissolved, Patterson was steadfast in his mission to remain independent. At every opportunity, advertising was explicit in its message that Patterson & Co. were not part of a trust. He also joined forces as part of the Independent Tobacco Manufacturers of the United States to formalize their organization in order to defend against the trust. Interestingly, during this time, a fire broke out at one of Patterson's main factories. I will leave it to you to decide if this was just a coincidence or something more sinister. It was around 1905 that Duke's Trust started tightening its noose around Patterson even further. This culminated in the shock resignation of Patterson's Vice President John Landstreet from the Independent Tobacco Manufacturers Association around concerns of a new rule requiring all members to sign an affidavit, put up a $1,000 bond, and swear an oath that should they ever come into contact with the trust, either directly or indirectly, that they would inform the association and resign immediately. The end for Patterson was not far. Further pressure was added in the form of a lawsuit from P. Lorillard, which was then under the control of ATC. This claimed that Patterson infringed on a trademarked red tag that Lorillard used on their Climax tobacco tins. The presiding judge ruled in favor of Lorillard, but a matter of weeks after the ruling, an agreement was reached between the two sides, bringing the litigation to a sudden end. The details of the settlement was not made public. Not long after, there was a subtle but highly significant change to Patterson's advertising. Note the complete lack of any mention stating that their tobacco was not made by a trust. It must have been a bitter pill to swallow for Patterson. But from then on in, American Tobacco obtained all rights to the Lucky Strike brand. Luckies, as they have been so affectionately nicknamed, were the brainchild of two key executives at American Tobacco. The first, George Washington Hill, who started with ATC in 1904. Hill's father was vice president at the time, working under James Buchanan Duke himself. After ATC was split up in 1911, Hill became sales manager, whilst his father, Hill Sr., was promoted to president of the company. The second was Charles Penn, whose family was involved in the tobacco industry, and with whom Charles worked from a young age. Penn joined American Tobacco in 1913 and was an assistant to one of the production managers. But why were Hill and Penn so obsessed with creating a new brand of cigarettes such as Lucky Strike? In a word, Camel. The Camel brand was introduced by R.J. Reynolds in 1913 and soon became one of the best-selling cigarettes of the time. About 500 million were sold the year after its launch, approximately 3% of the national total. Suffice it to say that Hill was both obsessed and determined to topple their latest competitor. Back to ATC, and Penn had been working with the manufacturing team and experimenting with different varieties of Burley tobacco, until he came up with a new blend of Burley white tobacco. Records indicate that Hill was intoxicated by the aroma coming from the manufacturing room, and it reminded him of morning toast. The slogan, "It's Toasted," was soon coined and accompanied by the explanation that, like bread, if you toast tobacco, it instantly improves the flavor. The newspapers and radio were suddenly flooded with similar advertising. And here it is, the very first generation pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes, dating to between the end of 1916 and the beginning of 1917, right at the national launch. You can date the pack by the blue tax stamp at the top. And as we'll see as we go along, the actual design of Lucky Strike cigarettes didn't change much over the first few decades. Hill was credited with much of the innovative marketing strategies employed by ATC, and even hailed a PR genius by many. But this was not the case, as we shall see next. Regardless, it was his ambition to lead the market with Lucky Strikes, and to make as many Americans as possible a Lucky smoker. Whilst an immediate success, sales of Luckies didn't take off as much as Hill had anticipated, with momentum falling and less than a 10% market share in 1918. But by then the world was at war, and America declared war on Germany just months after the introduction of Luckies in April 1917. Tobacco was a must-have for every soldier entering the war, and cigarettes in particular. Soldiers needed a fast smoke. It was no use trying to light and finish smoking a cigar when one needed to be alert at all times and ready for battle. Sales of Luckies increased during the war but then fell again once the war ended, with cigars coming back into play again. If we take a moment to pause our story so that I can show a comparison of the very early Lucky Strike packs and their designs. On the left, you will have seen the first generation Lucky Strike cigarette pack dating from the end of 1916 to early 1917. And on the right, this is a military service cigarette pack given to military personnel that dates to the First World War. Very little differences are apparent on the two packs. And the only things you might notice are the slightly different coloring of the reds and the golds. And this is simply due to the differences in the print runs of the wrappers. Next, comparing the military service pack on the left with another pack on the right dating to 1917. And this is a 16 count pack versus the 20 count on the left. Again, apart from differences due to the print run of the wrappers, the design of both packs are pretty much identical. Back to our story then. Hill was not beaten yet. There was still one untapped consumer that no cigarette manufacturer had been able to win, and that was the female smoker. During the 1920s, women were becoming more confident and were daring to smoke more in public. Hill realized he had to win the female smoker in order to succeed. And it was his advertising executive, Edward Bernays, who suggested first that the reason why Lucky's was not winning with women was because the green color did not agree with them, specifically because it was a color that clashed with their clothing. Bernays recommended that Hill change the color of the packaging, to which Hill said, "I've spent millions on advertising the package, and now you ask me to change it? That's lousy advice." Instead, Hill embarked on a campaign to get the fashion industry to make green the fashionable color. He would pay designers to make green outfits, artists to make green works of art, and so on. This didn't work, but it was not until another PR man that Hill employed, Albert Lasker, who came up with the idea that smoking a cigarette could replace eating a sweet or candy. It is said that Lasker's idea stemmed from a doctor's appointment that his wife had and was advised to smoke a cigarette before her meals to calm her nerves. It also aided in digestion and killed her appetite. Coincidentally, it was said that Hill also had the same idea as Lasker at the same time, and this was based on records stating that at one time Hill had seen a rather stout lady on the street chewing gum, and then straight afterwards, an attractive lady smoking a cigarette. Well, clearly smoking a cigarette was better than chewing gum. More likely, it was this idea that Lasker had planted in Hill's mind, so as not to take credit from a man he knew was an egomaniac. And once again, but this time starting in 1928, the first advertisements started to appear, promoting Lasker's, or Hill's, idea of reaching for a Lucky rather than eating a sweet. Their PR team hooked onto the premise that smoking Luckies could help control weight gain, and this in turn gained traction with the ladies of the period. The campaign was a resounding success, with sales of Luckies hitting record highs, making them American Tobacco's bestseller, but also the top-selling cigarette brand in 1930. Luckies continued to sell well through the 1930s and into the 1940s, But let's take another pause to do a further comparison of the design from where we left off in 1917 through to the period of the Second World War. On the left, the same 16 count pack dating to 1917, and next to it a cardstock box of 10 dating to 1922. Next, from 1922 through to a 12 count box from 1931. And finally, we compare the box from 1931 with a soft 20 count pack from 1942. Apart from a slight change in the font size for the word cigarettes, the overall designs are once again identical, with the same "It's Toasted" slogan still being used. It was during the two war years of 1941 and 1942 that two major changes occurred in the design of Lucky's for two very different reasons. And these design changes would still remain until the present day. The first was due to a Federal Trade Commission ruling against Hill, requiring him to change the slogan targeting women to "Avoid overindulgence if you would maintain that modern, ever-youthful figure. Reach for a Lucky instead." Clearly this was an absolute mouthful and would never catch on. So Hill once again got his PR agency at the time to come up with a new slogan. Lucky Strike means fine tobacco, or LSMFT. This would replace all other slogans, and advertising started as early as the autumn of 1941, although the actual changes to pack design would not come until the end of 1943. The second major change was one that Hill had been advised to make from the 1920s, and he finally got his chance. Claiming that the war effort needed the pigment that made his precious packs of Lucky's green, he boldly changed the colour of the packaging from green to white. In reality, this was not the case, and no branch of the war effort ever needed this. However, it gave Hill the excuse to spin this into a very successful campaign. You may also have come across advertisements of the period, proclaiming that Lucky Strike Green has gone to war. So here's the smart new uniform for fine tobacco. The two packs shown date to the Second World War, with the one on the left an exceedingly rare promotional pack made and donated by the Consolidated Vultee Aircraft Company for US Air Force aircrews only, flying the B-24 Liberator. On the right is a military issue Lucky with the yellow military stamp still affixed. Following this, a pack of grey Luckies, which is compared to the standard military issue pack. It is said that the grey packs were made for advertising on television, as in those days most people watched black and white, so it wasn't necessary to have a fully coloured pack. The 1940s continued to be very successful for Lucky Strike, but after Hill passed away in 1946, things started to go downhill, and the 1950s brought on a much more different competitive landscape. So much so that American Tobacco decided to switch their focus away from Lucky's and instead to their Pall Mall brand. Lucky's would go from being the top-selling brand of the 1930s and 40s to number 4 in the 1960s. Interestingly, Camels would never drop from the top 2 or 3, but that is the subject of another video perhaps. I will end my story here, but I hope that I have succeeded in sharing my passion of collecting cigarette packs through this first video showcasing Lucky Strikes. I aim to produce many more videos to share the stories of the makers of many other cigarette brands that I own. Before I finish, I would like to add that whilst I collect cigarette-related advertising items, I do not smoke myself nor condone smoking in any fashion. The negative impacts of smoking on health are well documented, and I collect for the history and beauty of the items, not for their consumption. I would love to hear from you. If you have any questions about this video, or general comments about collecting cigarettes, you can find my contact details here. And once again, thank you so much for watching.